a workshop and seminar series session. As you know, the CSH is a multidisciplinary research center with particular focus on South Asia, covering grounds ranging from sociology, history, demography, geography, anthropology, and political science. Today, we will hear quite fascinating work in progress of Laurent Glattli. Laurent is a doctoral student based at the Department of South Asian Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. His PhD is supported by the Berlin Senate and the German Academy of Exchange Service. He's an alumnus of the Institut Politique de Toulouse. Laurent works on a history of heritage conservation policies in South Asia and has a particular focus on the Archaeological Survey of India, which we will be talking about today. A colonial institution who became, after independence, one of the caretaker of Indian national heritage, or the caretaker of Indian national heritage. Today, Laurent Glattli will be discussing the drivers of conservation in its policies in India, its bureaucratic procedures, and the classification criteria that the institution uses for monuments. His presentation and his paper notes will be discussed by Professor Hilal Ahmed. Hilal is based at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS. He works on political Islam, Muslim politics of representation, the politics of symbol in South Asia. He's the author of, among others, Muslim Political Discourse in Post-Colonial India, published by Routledge in 2014. He edited and published 3 additional volumes, including the recent anthology, Companion to Indian Democracy. Professor earned his PhD from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in SOAS, 2007. So without further ado, and once again, on behalf of CSH, I would like to apologize for our slight delay due to an extended previous meeting we had this afternoon. I leave the ground to Laurent for his presentation for around 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by the discussion, discussion part led by Hilal Ahmed, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Laurent, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Thomas, and thanks to CSH for giving me this opportunity to present. It's the first time I'm presenting some of my preliminary results after a month of fieldwork, so it's an exciting opportunity. And thank you, Hilal Ahmed, also for accepting to be the discussant of my paper. Your book on Muslim political discourse was very useful to me at the beginning of my research, so I hope that the comments will be fruitful. So, as Jean-Thomas mentioned, I will discuss about India's conservation policies in the 1960s. So, let me start with 3 names, Ayodhya, Kashi, Mathura. The names of these cities are synonymous with contested heritage sites. These are cities where you have a mosque that stands or that used to stand next to a site that many Hindus consider sacred. Incidentally, these mosques are also considered monuments under protection by the Indian state, and they are thus considered part of the nation's heritage. In the decades after independence, these buildings have been increasingly contested and challenged, and some movements sought to right the wrongs of history by destroying them and building Hindu temples in their place. And it culminated with the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in 1992. More sites are under threat from revisionist movements. These movements are a testimony to what Deborah Steen calls the hegemony of heritage. She writes that historic sites and buildings have become battlegrounds in identity politics and attempts to rewrite history. And as she writes, those who control heritage control a narrative about the past and thus control the present. So this gives us some insight as to why heritage has become such an important stake in politics today. So let me start by defining what heritage is. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, heritage is something that has been or may be inherited, that it will be passed from one generation to the next. The idea of cultural heritage also implies that what is passed on is also collectively owned by people who share a same culture. So it symbolizes the continuity of a cultural group. It is a tangible proof of a community's past, and it must be preserved today as a gift to future generations. So it's no surprise that heritage has often been used and often been associated with the concept of nationhood. The designation of national monuments serves as illustrations of a widespread of a narrative that is being told about the past of the national community. So heritage, in a sense, they embody this historical narrative in the public space. In the case of India, with its long, complex, multi-layered history with a wide diversity of religious, ethnic groups who were sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in conflict, there are many different narratives about the past that compete for dominance in the public sphere.
Right here.
Heritage is part of the struggle for dominance about these narratives. In this concept, keeping this in mind, I chose to focus on the conservation policy implemented by the Indian state after independence. And the broader topic of my PhD is to see to what extent was heritage put to the service of the project of nation building. More precisely, I focus my research on the history of the Archaeological Survey. Why? Because this institution is the central government organization in charge of India's conservation policy, and it has been so since the late 19th century. The ASI is tasked with the protection of national heritage monuments protected by the central government. And as its name suggests, it's also the main institution conducting archaeological excavations and research. So as Jean-Thomas briefly explained, ASI was founded in 1861 by Alexander Cunningham, by British colonial authorities. As its name indicates, its first function was to survey the subcontinent, that is to look for ancient ruins to excavate and monuments to preserve. Sites and buildings of historical interest were repaired and protected by ASI. We must keep in mind that this was part of a larger endeavor of Orientalist research to gain knowledge over the subcontinent to better control its societies. And the creation of ASI and its development need also to be placed in the wider context of the conservation movement that started in 19th century Europe and spread to the colonies. Lord Curzon, who was viceroy from 1899 until 1903, really developed conservation because he had a personal interest in it. And under his impulse, ASI was revived and a comprehensive legal framework was passed. One act in particular, the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act, was passed in 1904. The ASI was granted a budget that was commensurate with its objectives, and its administrative structure started taking the shape it still has today. As Director General of ASI, Curzon recruited John Marshall, who headed the survey from 1902 until 1928, who was instrumental in developing a manual for conservation in 1923, and that ASI archaeologists still use until today. Under John Marshall, the ASI trained several generations of Indian archaeologists. Just before independence, the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler became its Director General and undertook major reforms, notably in training, human resources policies. And he was the one who presided over the partitioning of ASI in 1947. Partitioning was a a bitter affair. It led to the division of ASI staff and assets, and including museum artifacts. In 1951, a declaration of national importance declared that all monuments that used to be protected by government would be national monuments. And later, the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act of 1958 made it possible for the government to declare any monument to be of national importance. The Act also made provisions for the declaration of state departments of archaeology. So after this brief introduction on ASI's history until the 1960s, I will explain its administrative structure very briefly. It has a director general. At the time I'm studying, it's Amalananda Ghosh, and then it's divided in 10 circles across the country, each headed by a superintendent. And circles boundaries do not necessarily match with state boundaries. It has also departments like archaeological chemistry, museums, gardening, etc. And its main missions are to conserve, to excavate, so that is to conduct the archaeological research, and to survey the country to find more sites to preserve. So I base my study of ASI on an anthropology of public policy and public organization, or sociologie des politiques publiques, and focus on understanding the decision-making process of ASI officers and staff. And I focus on the factors that influence policy implementation. So from the directive of the government, what modifies the initial order and how this leads to the result that we see in the end. So I look at the degree of autonomy that individuals may have, or the influence of administrative routines, the bureaucratic politics with other public institutions. And what I will focus on today is the mental representations that influence how heritage policy is implemented, seen through the discourse that officers employ. My primary data is comprised of ASI records kept in the National Archives of India for the decade of the 1960s. So they are records of the New Delhi headquarters. So what I argue in this conference paper is that what characterizes Indian conservation policy in the 1960s is not rupture with colonial policy, but rather continuity. So to demonstrate this, I will analyze the discourse used by ASI officers and show that it's still embedded in a rather narrow conception of heritage as top-down and elitist. So at this point, I need to introduce the operative concept of authorized heritage discourse, which is a classic in critical heritage studies. So this concept was coined by Laura Jane Smith in 2006, and it refers to the hegemonic discourse about heritage that characterized the conservation movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Western Europe. So it is characterized by a greater importance given to materiality. So it is physical structure of a building counts more than the traditions and the cultural practices associated to it. A view of heritage as necessarily old, monumental, and grand, something impressive. It gives a lot of importance to the role of experts and scholars, who are people who are supposed to be endowed with the necessary knowledge to gauge the historical and aesthetical interest of a building. More generally, this type of discourse sees heritage as the prerogative of the elite, and for the elite, for the educated people. So it's no surprise that it's a rather top-down approach, where heritage, the designation of what counts as heritage is decided by experts and often implemented by the state. Heritage of the dominant groups, especially, for instance, of the nobility, is often overrepresented over that of marginalized groups. And this authorized heritage discourse leads to conservation practices that prefer keeping monuments as dead or frozen in time. They should be kept as found, and they should not continue to be used, to be performing the use that they were built for. And this concept and the principle that derived from it were enshrined in international conventions on conservation, like the Athens Charter of 1931 or the Venice Charter of 1964. And these conservation principles spread globally, and they were increasingly challenged for their inadequacy in other cultural contexts, and especially in Asia and Africa from the 1970s onward. For the purpose of this presentation, I equate the authorized heritage discourse with a colonial conception of heritage. And I use it as an analytical lens to show how it endures in the discourse used by Indian archaeologists in the 60s. So, sorry for this long introduction. I structured this presentation in two parts. The first one is looking at how national heritage is defined and how, especially how conservation experts define it. And the second, I will mostly focus on the elitism part of conservation. So who is the real beneficiary of heritage? So what is national heritage? If after independence, the new government of India, who was headed by Jawaharlal Nehru and assisted by his Minister for Education, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, try to define a new policy for archaeology and conservation, they created the Central Advisory Board of Archaeology, which meets once a year and is chaired by the Minister for Education, and brings together bureaucrats from the ASI, the Department of Tourism, state government representatives, academics, etc. It's meant to define a policy that reflected the new nation's ideas of secular nationalism and contribute to building a unifying narrative where India's different communities and states would be equally represented. The role of the board is mostly to define orientations and to approve recommendations for protection or deprotection of monuments or priorities for archaeological excavation or the conservation programs for the next year, budget, etc. But so this is what happens at the input level. But if you go down the policy chain, then you have the people who are in charge of implementing this policy. And these are what is often referred to as ASI officers. So the people in managing position within ASI. So the superintendents of the different circles. And these ones are the ones who are in charge of translating these instructions into actions. And they have a large degree of autonomy in interpreting instructions, especially as they have to cover a large area. And at least in the 1960s, communications were rather slow. So the organization of ASI was rather decentralized. They have multiple hats and they must perform different missions pertaining to conservation, excavation, exploration. As Nayanjot Lahiri points out, life in a circle is often the most exciting moment in the career of an officer, because it is then that they can make meaningful contributions and then be noticed for career advancement. They have limited financial and human resources, and they have to carry out repairs and maintenance of monuments, go on archaeological excavation campaigns. They have to publish also to be noticed. They correspond with government agencies. They respond to requests from interest groups, religious trusts, and have to manage the staff under their command. Nayanjot Lahiri shows that most of the officers who held important positions in Indian archaeology and conservation in the 1980s were all trained under the British. Especially a few batches from the year 1946 to 1948 were all trained under Director General Mortimer Wheeler's summer schools of archaeology. And in those you will find the most prominent names of Indian archaeology, such as M. N. Deshpande, B. K. Thapar, Sudhir Ranjan Das, Ahmad Asantani, S. R. Rao, Debala Mitra, or B. B. Lal. These people received a similar training, and they all came to dominate the field of institutional conservation and archaeology in the next decades until they retired. So we can assume that, we can postulate that colonial representations about what heritage is and should be lingered in their mind. And this is now what we'll try to see in looking at how they speak about monument of national importance, how they define what monuments are. So there is a legal definition of ancient monuments, which I will not read because it's too long. But what I'm interested in looking at is in the archives, what was the language they used to when they recommended monuments for protection and sent these recommendations to the headquarters in Delhi. So we can see that the buildings that qualify under circle officers, in circle officers' opinions, the buildings that qualify for protection are the ones that are representative of a certain architectural style or historical period. They look for buildings with significant inscriptions, which feature outstanding architectural elements or paintings, or those which are associated with certain historical events. However, there is a certain pattern that is hard to explain. They mostly use the adjective interesting and then do not really qualify what makes a building interesting. Or they would say that, for instance, the mosque in the Sher Shah Mosque in Purana Kila is a lovely mosque. So they use statements of aesthetical appreciation, or but they don't feel like they need to explain what makes a building lovely or beautiful or interesting. So I interpret it as a way that they don't feel like they need to justify it, that they know that they are talking to experts who share the same mental representations about and the same aesthetical and historical references about what counts. So they do not have to, they are experts speaking to experts, and these do not come under external scrutiny. It's also interesting to see what does not count as monuments worthy of protection. The criteria of historical interest or architectural interest is sometimes interpreted narrowly, and it ends up excluding houses of prominent individuals. For instance, there's a request in 1961 for the protection of a house which was believed to be where the Sufi saint Nizamuddin Auliya was born, in Badar. This request was denied. Another, in 1962, another request for the protection of the house in Delhi where Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was born was also denied. And in both cases, the ASI replied that the building is a residential house with no architectural or any feature of interest, and it's not considered worthy of protection as a monument of national importance. Another criteria that they keep in mind, and that is very coherent with this idea of authorized heritage discourse, is that monuments need to be old, and the legal definition of monument is that it has to be more than 100 years old. So in 1960, that leaves out practically every structure built after the Indian Rebellion in 1857. So most colonial buildings or the houses of freedom fighters. This excludes the possibility of preserving traces of founding moments of the Indian nation, such as the movement for independence or partition. For instance, in Purana Kila or Humayun's tomb in Delhi, these are two monuments that were used as refugee camps to host the refugees first leaving from Delhi to Pakistan and coming from Pakistan into Delhi. The collaboration between ASI and the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation was not easy, to say the least. And after the monuments were handed back to ASI, the ASI worked hard to erase all traces of damages caused by the use of these monuments as refugee camps. For them, it was important to restore them to their earlier and more authentic, or what they thought was authentic, look. So one can understand the will to forget the traumatic experience of partition displacement just after 1947. However, we can still wonder, at least today, from today's perspective, if it wouldn't be a good thing to acknowledge these sites' more recent history, because they played a role in the history of many of Delhi's families. And it would surely help face the trauma, the collective trauma of partition, if these sites were developed as sites of memory. But it seems that the history of refugees counted less, at least at the time, than the history of ancient kings. Let's see, I will briefly talk about the deprotection and the transfer of monuments to states. So, as you know, India is a federal state, and you have the central government level and the state level. From 1960 onward, the process of transfer of monuments that were centrally and thus nationally protected, this process started to have some monuments transferred to states, so that their state importance, their local importance was recognized, but they were not considered important enough to be nationally important. This was a rather massive wave of deprotection. Some of them just completely lost their status as protected monuments when they were considered to be not significant enough, sometimes for very arbitrary reasons. But when you look at records, and especially records of the Central Advisory Board of Archaeology, you see that there was a lot of, it was a rather messy affair. It was decided by the central government, but state governments were not always in the loop. And there was a lack of preparation, lack of communication, and states complained that the central government didn't even bother checking what was happening to monuments after they were transferred, or if the state actually had the legislation for protecting monuments. Consequences in terms of human resources were also not anticipated. So when you had monuments attendants who used to work on a site, like guard, for instance, who used to work on a site, and all of a sudden his monument became a state monument, the guard kept his attachment to the central government and was not transferred to the states. So I interpret this massive wave of deprotection as a rather crude attempt to reduce the financial burden of protection on the ASI, to have states share the cost. But as we see, this process and the general process of declaring a monument part of national heritage is subject to contingencies. It's subject to some part of arbitrariness from officers, and the legal criteria are one thing, but there is much more interpretative power in the hands of the people who implement the policy. So let us now briefly look at how the state establishes its control over monuments. And once a monument has been recommended for protection, what is the procedure for protection to actually be enforced? So for this, the circle superintendent would have to draw a site plan, and for that he would have to go to the district collector. The district collector would give him maps, and then they would maybe have to buy a few houses around to make sure that the site is not, as they say, encroached. And then this site plan would have to be approved by the deputy commissioner and then the state government. So as you see, there's a lot of different authorities that come into the process. Each time requires negotiations, because conservation of monuments might not be the priority of these agencies. Sometimes some works are needed. There's a case of a school that had been set up in a mosque that the ASI wanted to protect, and it took 5 years to expel the school. Or sometimes a road is needed to access the site, but nobody wants to commit money to build a road. And what comes rather often in those files is to see that the process drags on for 5-6 years, and then after, when the protection is finally processed, then the monument doesn't exist anymore. It has been destroyed or defaced, or yes. So, and we can imagine that many structures were lost during this process. Once a monument is finally protected, then the state must enforce the legal protection. So for that, it erect fences around sites that are considered threatened, and especially in the 1960s, that's when fences were built in a more systematic way. Guards were also hired, and the goal was to protect sites from vandalism, defacement, to keep away so-called encroachers. Fencing also enabled controlling the flow of visitors, was also a way to monetize heritage by imposing ticketed entry. But when a monument gets fenced in, then it's cut away from its surrounding. It becomes, in a way, frozen in time, and the people who used to live around it and use it for social, or spiritual, or economic purpose, then cannot access it anymore. In a way, and this was shown by Hilal Ahmed, Silva Encina, or Deborah Steen, this is a phenomenon of dispossession of local communities by the state. The monument now belongs to the state and to the visitors, but not to local communities. And this connection is, there are many examples of this, and it's often one of the biggest criticism against conservation measures in all of South Asia. One example I could find is when the complex of the Humayun's tomb in Delhi was fenced and a big wall was built around it. The manager of a small dargah, a Sufi shrine within what was known the enclosed area, complained that access was now impossible for people who wanted to pray, that there was a Qabristan, a cemetery on the site, that it had been encroached upon by the ASI, that it had molested the dead bodies of his ancestors, that something that was, I quote, unbecoming of a responsible department of secular India. So this illustrates how protection of monuments suddenly disrupts the connection of a local community, the connection that this community may have with a place. The state establishes its monopoly over the place's meaning and erases whatever meanings that are given to this place by other people. It shows a rather heavy-handed top-down approach, again, by experts who know better and often do not bother collecting the opinions of people who live around the place. So, so in a way that is enforcing a rather elitist vision of heritage, and this brings me to my second part, for whom is heritage being conserved? And one can see that fencing can is used to control who comes to the building and also people who come around. And it's not uncommon that, at least we find instances in the archives, that state control can be exploited by elite social groups who know their way, who will campaign for heritage protection in the neighborhood in order to keep undesired elements away. So there's this interesting letter, for instance, by the residents of the Green Park colony in Delhi, addressed to the Director General of ASI. So it's a rather posh gated community close to many monuments near Hoskas. They sought action of ASI to fence in the monuments, to transform it into a nice heritage park. But their request seemed motivated by more than simply benefiting from recreational area, as you can read. It was clearly to keep the poor, the labor class, away from their own neighborhoods. Note also the use of misusing the area. There's this idea that only certain people, only the educated know how to behave in a monument, the dominant class who is educated enough to appreciate it. This notion of misusing and of mistrusting the visitor is very visible in attempts to discipline the visitors, and that's something that also comes up quite often in the archives. And you see that most often the visitor is seen as someone in need to be controlled and who will not behave properly, who will not respect the untold codes of behavior at the site. So there's this interesting letter which I leave the screen that is quite telling. What is also telling is how the state authorities reacted, because this letter was sent by an American citizen to the chief minister of Maharashtra, and it was then forwarded to SI, who immediately decided to have the guards posted at the caves and the museum to check the discipline among the visitors. We see, and we'll come back to it, that comments by foreigners often carry a strong impact. This is in line with other studies, for instance, by Tapati Guhatakurta on the museum as a disciplined space where visitors are supposed to behave according to rules laid by people who know how to behave there. So the rule would be only looking, no touching, staying silent, and of course not showing devotion to sculptures, to religious sculptures on sites. I will not go into details about the question of worship at protected monuments, because this is something that Hilal explored in details in Muslim Political Discourse. I will just briefly mention that ASI makes a distinction between places of worship that were functional at the time of the declaration of protection and the sites that were inactive. So in the first case, ASI enters negotiations with the religious trust that manages the site and ensures that no alterations or repairs are made that go against conservation principles. In the case of inactive places, ASI has full control and does not allow worship. Visitors can keep their shoes on in temples or mosques, etc. So legally, the status of a monument is frozen on the day it was protected. And this was reaffirmed in 1991 in the context of the Ayodhya judgment. But in practice, you see that ASI officers have to often reply negatively to requests for opening monuments to worship, and they must deal daily with visitors performing acts of devotion, such as, I don't know, touching the statues, and which would, for them, would amount to defacing. As I mentioned, the foreign tourist is often comes as the figure of the ideal visitor, the one that justifies conservation expenses. It's not very surprising in the post-colonial context in India that foreign visitors receive a much better treatment than Indian visitors. They are seen, as well as the westernized Indian elite, as the legitimate visitors to sites. When they think about foreign visitors, the figure that comes is the American rich tourist. This was, by the way, before the development of the hippie trail and the broke backpackers that traveled from the West. The fact that visitors visit a site is often used to prioritize conservation of this particular site. It's interesting to see also that sometimes the figure of the foreigner is called as a witness to remind the state of its commitment to secularism. So you have a letter by the Shahi Imam of the Jama Masjid in Delhi in 1962 that commends the repair done by ASI, but he also stresses that it is important to, I quote, allow the foreign visitors to go with the correct impression of the way the various interests are protected by the government of India. So in a way, the foreign tourist is here to make sure the government protects the minorities. there's this, yes, sorry. There's this very interesting letter, which you see on the screen now, this op-ed published in The Hindu by a British art historian, William Willett, who clearly makes the case for the poor foreign tourist and the one who brings his dollars, who should be treated much better than the screaming Indian schoolgirls. We see also in case of tourism development that foreign tourists' needs are considered more important than conservation priorities. In the correspondence between ASI and the tourism department about the transformation by the Maharana of Udaipur of his palace into the luxury Lake Palace Hotel, we see that despite ASI's request to protect the palaces as examples of late medieval art and architecture, it was powerless in the face of the economic interests that were against the project of the Maharana to transform his palace into a luxury hotel. Sorry, and the Department of Tourism was extremely happy to have a luxury hotel that received a lot of positive coverage. But at the same time, the Department of Tourism reminded ASI that they should better protect Udaipur monuments because this is what foreign tourists want to see. So historical temples around Udaipur have to be preserved. Let me come finally to the public purpose of heritage. I will go briefly on the enjoyment part. What I want to highlight is the question of education. So as I showed, the state, by protecting monument, holds a monopoly of the meaning of a site. So in a way, it is perceived as being the legitimate source of historical information about a protected place. So it has an educational role to play. There are two imperatives: the imperative of public education, of scholarly education, which means that the same information will not be staged for different publics. What I want to focus on, though, is the case of cultural notice boards. So this is how the ASI calls the interpretive signage that they put up at sites to give information about site's history. So these cultural notice boards are here to educate the public, educate scholars, but they also have another imperative, which is a political imperative. They are statements about the monument's history, which in the case of India can sometimes be problematic and give rise to tensions. However, I was not able, and this was confirmed to me by interviews, that there was no guideline on how to write cultural notice boards. So the drafting is left at the appreciation of the local circle superintendent. But sometimes you get requests, for instance, this one by the secretary of the Jamiat Ulema-e-Hind on a mosque in Pandua in West Bengal, which said that on the cultural notice board, it said that the beautiful carved stone in it came largely from Hindu temples demolished by the Muslims. So the secretary of the Jamiat Ulema-e-Hind asked the minister for cultural affairs to withdraw the text, which was done. And then it triggered a review. This is what I posted on the slide. An order from the ministry to review all cultural notice boards to make sure that no cultural notice board could create communal tensions, let's say. I was not able, unfortunately, to see in the files, in the records, if there was an internal reaction by the ASI. We can imagine that some scholars would have been opposed to changing factual informations for something that was more politically correct. We don't know how many cultural notice boards have been changed. We don't know who was responsible in the end for validating the new text. One thing that we can note, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who have ever noticed it, is that today when you visit an ASI monument, cultural notice boards are extremely boring. They only focus on the architecture of the monument. They say, oh, this tomb has 12 arches and this dome is, I don't know, 30 feet wide and it's made of brick and plaster. They don't say much about the monument's history. And I can only suggest that this may have been a case of, I don't know, self-censorship or laziness to not do too much, to not do too much historical research when writing these notice boards so as to be as benign as possible. So yes, I'm being told that I'm over time. So let me conclude now. I have attempted to show how conservation policy in the 1960s were still embedded in a Western canonical elitist top-down paradigm, which is reflected in the criteria used for designating what counts as national heritage, the way the control of the secular state is imposed at the expense of local meanings, and finally in the elitist way that heritage sites are developed for the visitors. The persistence of this discourse can be attributed to the lingering effects of the training that ASI officers received during the last years of colonial administration and their hold on conservation policy until the 1980s. But prominent Indian conservationists, even today, point out that this discourse remains the defining features of conservation policy. The old hegemonic paradigm of authorized heritage discourse has been challenged globally, particularly since the 1970s and the 80s with the emergence of the field of critical heritage studies or redefinition of notions such as authenticity. But in India, it seems that this paradigm lingers in the field of conservation and particularly in the work of ASI. There are newer generations of Indian architects and conservationists who are very keen to propose different approaches to heritage. Approaches that are more bottom-up, that give space to popular narratives, that represent a wider range of communities, that honor vernacular conservation methods. Yet, with ASI still holding a near monopoly on conservation, the emergence of such new projects remains an exception. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent, for this very detailed presentation. I have just asked Professor Ilal Ahmed to unmute himself. If you could try to, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. But how much time I have?
You're around 10 to 15 minutes, if it is fine with you.
No, I'm perfectly all right. I want others to take part in that because I think Laurent and we are the two people who know each other through this material quite intensely. So therefore, it would be great that others should also intervene and talk. Thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I really enjoyed reading it because you sent me the draft today. I read it and read it carefully. Then in your presentation, you actually also tried to elaborate the points which were not, adequately discussed in the paper which you sent to me. First of all, I think it's a great paper, and I must congratulate you to actually dig deep in those files where, first of all, it's very difficult to get access to these material. And second is that even if you manage to get it, establishing a link between a file A to file B is, the way in which the files are kept in ASI archive is really, really difficult task. Having said that, there are a few things, and whatever I'm going to say is basically to make a few comments, and these are suggestive in nature. So the purpose is to have more meaningful discussion on this idea. And from this vantage point, if I look at your presentation and the paper, I can immediately think of two ways to approach it. The first way is that I should travel with you and then try to look at the material which you are introducing to us and the kind of answers you are offering to us, and to find out, is there any connection between these two? That's the first possible way to get into the paper. The second is that I should actually get out of this process and then relook at the overall structure of the paper and make a few comments. So first, let us just go with you. I really, as I said, that it shows your hard work, and I would encourage you to actually do much more work on this. I think that first of all, a few technical things. Like, it would be important when you start with a definition conceptually and try to look at the material, because in many cases you find that your material is taking you in a different direction, while the definition which is given to us is quite restricted. So therefore, I find that some way or the other, you are trying to adjust the details, the fascinating details which you have excavated, and you are just trying to put that into a concept which we have elaborated quite well: authorized heritage discourse. I think at one stage it is perfectly all right, but at another stage, I think the post-colonial story of conservation gives us a very complicated picture, and your approach to, as if that you are trying to authenticate the argument made by Smith with regard to authorized heritage discourse, it appears to me. So I'll give you a few examples. For example, you started with these 5 or 6 points: materiality, expert life, top-down approach, in situ principle, etc. And you are right when you say that the archaeological officers were actually trying to do exactly the same thing. So at the very first level, your argument seems to be plausible and seems to be justifiable. But there is a second level of argument where we have to also look at the contestation that was going on in 50s and 60s. And somehow you missed that contestation. So I'll give you 2-3 examples. The first example is we have to go back to the Constituent Assembly debates. And in Constituent Assembly debates, there was a lot of emphasis on the idea of history. And there was a consensus that in making India a great nation state, there is a need to revisit the idea of history. And that's the reason why there is an official discourse of secularism of a different kind that is established. And this secularism is established in such a way that it should actually provide the guidelines or the overall architecture in which different institutions would evolve their own ways to express the forms in which secularism in India can be performed and can be observed. Now that secularism, the secularism that we have decided that the secularism of minority rights, secularism of principal distance, if I quote Rajiv Bhargav, that was there as a framework. But secularism of historical monument was different. Why? Because at that level, you have to remember that somehow partition created a very complicated picture. All the great Mughal monuments remained in India, while the great ancient monument of British times were in the Pakistan. So in order to construct a history of a different kind, the existing monument had to be interpreted rather differently. So therefore, because I think you got it right when you talked about the idea of introductory history. who wrote this history, etc. And when you say it, and this reductionism actually reflected there, when you said that ASI's representation of monument is a bit boring. But if you carefully look at the ways in which descriptions are given, you can certainly find out that there are 2-3 things in it. At the top level, there are 2 or 3 lines given to us in order to justify the idea of official history. But there are a lot of debates on a lot of information on architecture and the significance, artistic significance of the monument. It shows that there is a consensus. There is a consensus to accommodate both the dominant understanding of secularism, at the same time, the secularism of historical monument that evolved in these, messy situation. So your Jamiat Ulama Hind example would become more sensible if we read the introductory history given at the entrance of any protected monument in India through the prism of this contestation. So that's the first large point which I wanted to make, that we need to look at the contestation between 2 forms. And then the second example would be, I think it would be great if you read H.D. Sankalia, because in your story, Sankalia's stake is completely missing. He is the person who is trained by the British archaeologist, and he is interested in the archaeology of Ayodhya. This is the person who is deeply involved in the figure of Ram. So why Sankalia, a Marxist, is interested in the figure of Ram? And by the way, he is very much part of that great archaeological tradition. So that's the reason why I thought that it would be great if you complicate your framework. It is a very straightforward framework in which you have actually taken out a concept and you are just trying to justify it on the basis of rich material which you have excavated in your world. Now, this is when I go with you. I would take only 2 or 3 minutes to, when I get out and then read your paper differently, it gives me a very different interpretation. First of all, I think there is a need when we talk about post-colonial conservation policy. We also have to go back to a serious debate that took place in India, especially in the realm of archaeology, and that is the debate between excavation and conservation. There is a powerful argument in favor of excavation for knowing new history. But there is also a part of that argument is that there is a need to excavate what is conserved. So many historical places are actually become questionable when it is said that these buildings need to be destroyed to see what exactly there beneath them. So therefore, this debate between excavation and conservation is the serious debate within the circle of ASI. And I think you missed that point completely. So therefore, reducing everything to conservation won't help us. Now, as I said, that it would be great if we just get out of it. Then 2 more points. The first point is that, and it also answers the question when you could not find any clue why Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Nizamuddin Aulia's houses were not protected. Because obviously, the secularism of minority rights would make an argument that these people should be part of India's heritage, etc. But secularism of historical monument would say, no, it is not possible, because we have to follow a very strict non-interventionist kind of secularism in this case in order to avoid conflict. And remember, you are talking about a context between 50 to 60. And I'll give you one example that why in India, people were not interested in revisiting the idea of partition. Because, and there is a lot of literature on that why partition was completely missed. Remember that in India, the partition was seen as a traumatic event. And because of the trauma, everybody wanted to get rid of that. Monument had this, and I would recommend you to read Kaveri Baur's book. Monument had that tremendous capacity to invoke feelings, to create tension, and therefore, for all possible purposes, it was very important that there should be a dividing line between the religious practices and the protection of monument. So therefore, I think you need to complicate the picture by getting out of the files and situate them in the larger context. One final point, it would be great if you will find a lot of things in that. There was a conference that took place in 1961 when Archaeological Survey of India celebrated its centenary. Nehru gave a very thoughtful speech there, and H.D. Sankalia was there, and other people were also there. I think it would be great if you look at the debate at that time, especially how to think, how to popularize monument, how to get rid of the elitism that is involved in conservation of historical building, etc. So I think that would be important for you. Then I think I have, yeah. Again, there is a technical thing which you mentioned in passing. When ASI people decide that this particular building should be protected, and you said that they use the word like lovely, etc. And in the file, this is, you're right while interpreting these expressions. But remember that, there was actually a very strange, rigid rule. India was not a very rich country at that time. So therefore, how much money is needed to protect a historical building was a serious consideration. And that's the reason why there was a reluctance to actually expand the scope of the list of protected monument. That's one. Second, remember that, at the time of partition, many of the monuments were, the list that was prepared in British India. And, again, you have to understand the context very sensitively. India could not become a union of state in just 2 years. No, it took a lot of time. From 1947 to 1952, and I would say if I add 1956, when the State Reorganization Commission was established, that was the time when India, actually the India which we know now, came into existence. So therefore, the list, because there was 500 and more than 500 in princely states at that time, and many of these monuments were there. So it was complete mess. So in order to provide a proper list of monument was not so easy, and to that country which was actually newly independent. So therefore, that context must be understood sensitively. Only then we would be able to understand the conservation policy in post-colonial India. By the way, these were only suggestions. It is a fascinating work, and I would encourage you to, dig more. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Hilal, for these comments. I gladly take the criticism. To my defense, I try to simplify and probably to fit a little too much data into this presentation. So this is why I focused on discourse and this authorized heritage discourse.
Can I say something? Just a moment. I'm not saying that it's the other way around. I'm saying that you did not provide data. You did provide a lot of data and information. The problem is how to synthesize that data and information.
Oh, you're absolutely right. To come back to the question of the debate between excavation and conservation, archaeology and conservation, it took me quite some time in my intellectual process during this PhD to understand how the two were linked in India. And I come from a European understanding where these two are very different spheres and they are managed by different organizations. And I thought that at the beginning it would be possible to separate the two, but while looking at the archives, I realized that they were completely entangled, that they were practiced, they were carried out by the same people. that often these people had to choose between dedicating time and resource to conservation or to archaeology. And so this is something that I need to definitely dig more upon. The debates. Yes, I focused mostly on what I could find in the archives for now, and try to also complete that with readings around. I find it hard to state things that I do not find in the archives, which sometimes I feel like it's a bold move to state something, knowing that it seems plausible, but I have only limited evidence for that. So thank you for encouraging me to also try to link this more to debates, especially look at archaeologist debates, because again, this is something that I had not looked at the beginning, and now I'm trying to get back. There's this book by Nayanjot Lahiri on M.N. Deshpande, for instance, where she synthesizes the personal archives of M.N. Deshpande. And I'm planning to look at H.D. Sankalia's archives very soon also. So thank you.
Sana, we will be glad to have questions from the audience. If I'm sure many of you have important, crucial questions to ask to our speaker. For those who want to ask the question in the chat box, it's also possible, but I strongly suggest you raise your hand or unmute yourself or request to be unmuted. I see here. Maybe just give me a second.
Okay, here you go. Sorry. Hi, Laurent. How are you? I'm so glad to see you here today, and would like to congratulate you on your presentations. You know that we're working more or less on the same topic, and I find that your presentation very, very interesting. I would like to discuss two or three things, and I hope I will not be too long. First of all, definition is very, very important. I think that you should dig into the definitions of monument, especially in the Act of 1904, 1958, and the following ones. I mean, and you would just and look carefully at the definitions of a monument, because the 100 years, for instance, of age that would just justify the conservations of a monument is a post-colonial addition, which did not exist in 1904 and was added afterwards. That is a bit incongruous if you look at the lack of conservation in for houses, for instance. Then during my field work in India, when I was working on the same topic, I noticed something in the offices of the Archaeological Survey of India, and now I still see it in the readings of INTAC, for instance, is that there's a difference between heritage and monuments. The definitions of heritage is not the same as different definitions of monuments. Monuments are not I mean, let me be clear. When I ask why houses of more than 100 years were not conserved by the central government, the answer of the directors of monument preservations was because houses are heritage, they're not monuments. And it's quite interesting to see this difference. Then about the monuments of prominent figures, as the house of Sayyid Ahmed Khan, you have to see the reasons of the lack of conservations in two things. First, colonialism. I mean, it's a fact that the institutions of ASI is in the post-colonial period is an inheritance of the colonial institutions. But you have to know that houses, and especially Mughal houses, has never been considered as heritage. First of all, because especially in Delhi, they've been destroyed carefully by the colonial authorities for the sake of sanitary, of progress, and mostly for control of the city. Then they were treated as a commodity, and especially economical commodity, not as heritage, and there was no urban heritage notion. Now the second reason why ASI is not really looking at houses is something that you should probably look into. It's the contestation, how houses are contested as heritage by the owner themselves. I mean, many owners of houses and ancient historical houses refused the label of heritage, because heritage for us is something positive, but for the owner of the houses, it's a threat. And try just to look into this. Not everyone wants the house to be a heritage. About the lack of sorry, it's going to be my last point about the small descriptions. I think that the issue is a lack of narrative in conservation, and it's actually new. It's not proper to India. It's new. It's quite global, and you can find something. I mean, you can find a discussion on the issue in a book which is titled "Narrative Theory in Conservation" by Nigel Walter. Might just write to you the reference, but there's a lack of narrative in the criteria of recommendation, and that's true. But it's a global issue, I think. I must stop here because I have the feeling that I'm just taking too much time. But I'll be very happy just to share more things with you, in private by email if you want. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. Yes, you're making very good points. I did not go into details on the question of old houses and try to keep this on monuments themselves. It's true in Old Delhi. If you go there, if you talk to heritage owners, heavily owners, they just want to avoid the heritage tag. But it's also because the legislation is such that it makes any kind of alteration to those houses almost impossible, because you have different levels. You have the city level, the state level, the national level, that all mix because the city is so rich in monuments, and each monument has a protected or regulated zone of 300 meters around it. So that means that any structure in the vicinity needs authorizations to even change plumbing, for instance.
And you have to see that in the definitions of monuments in the Act, and especially just to dig into Marshall manual as well, and see how come that the monuments have been locked, and especially temples, for instance, were locked and protected from the public and surrounded by gardens. I think this is the clue, one of the clue.
Thank you. Just Hugo, maybe?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Laurent, thank you, Laurent. And I was very happy to finally hear more about your work. And so my question is, I know that at some point you were considering doing a comparison maybe with Pakistan, and I also understand that because of several factors, it might be difficult. But could you just tell us what are your ideas, like how different could be the narrative in Pakistan as compared to India? What are your ideas or insights?
So thanks, Hugo, for the question. And this was indeed my initial project when I started my PhD. I wanted to write a comparative history of conservation policy in India and Pakistan after independence, because I assumed that the two countries, at least in the region near Punjab, had similar monuments or heritage that could be qualified as homogeneous on both sides. This heritage had been managed by the same organization, the colonial ASI, by the same people, and it was divided in 1947. And after that, I wanted to see how conservation policy bifurcated in two directions. And for me, it would have been a way to highlight how national ideology influenced conservation policy, because it would be, let's say, the variable between the two case studies. Unfortunately, COVID happened. Then the political situation in Pakistan also deteriorated. So I was not able to go, and I decided to focus on India, where I could probably write 2 or 3 PhDs already. So instead of risking having 2 shallow studies, one of India's policy, one of Pakistan's policy, I'd rather focus only on India, but I'll keep the Pakistan idea for the postdoc.
We have maybe a last question from.
Thank you for the paper. I just, so 2 thoughts. One is about municipalization and sort of alerting you to scales of governance, about how city level conservation works as against national level. So a lot of your instances about parks and people reacting to monuments and keeping away uncivil people. So that's I was wondering if that's a separate section, or that's a different cluster of things to think about from national level policies, and that's something you want to develop later, or develop separate from just policy around monuments, because that's where you can play with, let's say, ethnographic material and think about how those monuments and that conservation policy survives today, in that sense, because a lot of those monuments still live within public housing, or especially in Green Park.
Yeah.
So many of these monuments are now surrounded by gated communities. So what happens then? So
these monuments are protected by the central state. So they are managed, and the gardens, the parks are planted and managed by the central state. So there is relation with the Delhi Public Works Departments, for instance, to have some works done, and of course the cooperation with municipal authorities is there, but it's not managed by the city, only by the state government.
But in terms of people, like people's engagement with the way
that is something I would love to read.
Yeah,
and
so
I'm calling on all the public here. If anyone knows of an ethnographic study of the Indian public to monuments, I would absolutely love to read it and see what monuments, heritage sites, heritage parks represent in people's minds. How do they appreciate it? I think that would be a fascinating study. I don't know if this has ever been done. Something comprehensive, but at the Indian level or state or city level.
You'd be in a good position to do it. And also come out of the archive once in a while.
Yes.
Just breathe a little. But my second point is about tourism and how and when India as a nation and its national heritage steps into the international tourist, like you said, there's a heritage trail that is before the whole hippie sort of situation. And when does the nation and tourism sort of stand in for each other, and in the global like post-colonial trail, like of heritage? And so India, Egypt, or even just all the Commonwealth colonies, how did they become exhibits in themselves of post-colonial or like societies who are then trying to preserve some kind of history? So a certain Oriental gaze.
There is definitely self-Orientalist gaze that is applied by India when it tries to promote itself on the international stage.
Yeah.
You can see like in the Air India Maharaja, for instance, or many things, and Air India posters when they advertise come to India in the 50s or 60s. Yeah. I focus on conservation policy, not on tourism policy, which would also be, I think, interesting.
Just being alert about it, so that the Oriental space thing also.
But when you look at their relations, the tourism department and the archaeology department, they do not seem to speak the same language. Okay. They have very different priorities, and often they fight because ASI wants to control and tourism department wants to develop the site. They want coverage, they want more visitors. One thing that ASI does not directly benefit from visitors to monuments. It's when you pay a ticket, an entry ticket to a monument, it goes to the Central Board of Revenues. So the pool where the central government gets all its money from. And then the government allocates a fixed budget to ASI every year. But ASI has no real incentive in developing monuments as tourist attractions.
Right.
They're just here for conservation.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Maybe we have a final question from Laurent Glattli in the.
I think Hilal also has a question. Hilal, I'll be very quick so that you have the final word. Thank you, Laurent, for this really interesting presentation. It was nice to hear more about what you're working on. I have, so first you said, you asked a question about ethnography, if there's an ethnography of monuments, and, I immediately thought of Anand Taneja genealogy on Firoz Kutla, which is, of course, a really interesting, ethnographic study of how people use Firoz Kutla not as a monument, but very much as a religious site. So I don't know how much you engage with this work. No, but I was thinking, since Hilal is here, and you started your presentation by mentioning Ayodhya, Kashi, and Mathura, to what extent? So if I understand well, your period, the time period is the early independence period up to the 1960s. Now, to what extent do you also try to connect your work with the more recent developments around the communalization of historical sites, and especially in the case of Ayodhya, but not exclusively. Of course, Hilal's work is on Jama Masjid and Ayodhya, and I was wondering to what extent you're trying to connect your study of the 1950s and 60s with all the bitter controversies that unfold already that already start, of course, in the 1940s and 50s, but that really gain full that fully blow in the 1980s and 90s. So since you started your presentation with this, I was somehow expecting that you might connect your work with the latter period. Are you doing it in your research work? If yes, in what way? Thank you.
So when I look for, when I select records and I request records, I am on the lookout for contested sites, especially contested mosques or temples. And this is something that I always try to pick when I select records. I'm on the lookout for these sites. In particular, I could find one file on the Dharara Masjid, so the Alamgir Mosque in Benares, Varanasi. In the 1950s, it was a rather boring file with only mentioning repairs to one of the towers, the minarets that had collapsed, and how it was decided to repair it with the state-of-the-art technology. And I noted that as I knew that it was a sensible, sensitive site, but they prioritized the feelings of the Muslim community there. They made sure that the Imam of the masjid was on board, and it wasn't really about, not at all about the discourse that will then develop in the decades after. I found some interesting files on the reaction of ASI to the book by P.N. Oak that claims that the Taj Mahal is Tejo Mahalaya Hindu temple, where they basically say it's rubbish. They already in the 60s, you find parliamentary questions that it's often an interesting type of files to study, where MPs ask, oh, is it true that Qutub Minar is actually a Hindu Vijay Stamp, Tower of Victory? So every time when such questions are asked, and it happens, I don't know, 2 or 3 times in a year, maybe, they make sure that they respond to those questions with as many facts as possible to get the facts straight.
Okay, but for example, the fact that there is a sensitivity to the role of the imam, for example, in the mosque that you mentioned earlier. Maybe you can connect this point with one of the points that Hilal was making during his comments about what kind of heritage discourse do we have, and in the early 1960s, at least, it seems that there is a concern about minority rights, and this may of course change over time. Early 1960s, it's still the Nehruvian period. There is a strong concern of Nehru to make sure that Muslims are included in the Indian nation, which is not something that is a given, given the legacy of partition. So maybe here you can integrate this really interesting document that you have found into something that, into what Hilal was suggesting about the different kinds of heritage discourses that develop at that time. So yeah, anyway, but thank you for your presentation, and thank you also, Hilal, for your precious comments.
Hilal, do you have
quick
final word, since you have
not final word, but just just 2 quick suggestions. One, I wanted to tell you about Anand's book. So I think it's a very interesting ethnography of people who visit these sites and then they envisage spade and other things inside the building, etc. So that was something which I also wanted to tell you. The other thing is that I also made a film on Qutub Minar, where we have tried to interview common people and look at their perception or their everydayness with regard to that. But what I wanted to tell you at this moment, this is actually a final comment, is actually, I wrote a paper which is called Official Memory of India. And that came out in 2016. There's a book by Nivedita Menon, Sanjay Palshikar, and Aditya Nigam. I think it was published by Oriental Black Swan. And what I actually, extension of my earlier work, I tried to look at the post-colonial period. And in that article, I tried to conceptualize the idea of official memory in post-colonial India. And I very categorically try to look at the debates which we are actually touching upon, and then try to suggest that actually there are 3 things in post-colonial India which we must pay attention to whenever we talk about conservation. One is the idea of monument. That is, we understand that there is a legal definition to it, etc. But there are 2 other things which are very specific to post-colonial period. One is memorial. So the idea of monument is different from the idea of memorial in a significant way. So Jallianwala Bagh and India Gate, these are not monument, these are memorials. Now, what is the difference? Let me tell you the third thing, and then I'll make the final point. The third is very specific site of memory in post-colonial India, that is Samadhi. So you have monument, you have memorial, and you have Samadhis. And the connecting, all these things are connected to each other to produce something called the official memory. the ways in which state would like us to remember the past. This is very specific, and how memorials are different from, say, monument. Obviously, this 100 years thing, 100 years old definition is certainly there. But there is another thing, that inside a particular monument, because of in situ principle, you are not allowed to change it. But in case of memorial, you are entitled to make certain changes. And this is precisely what Indira Gandhi did when Amar Jawan Jyoti was installed inside India Gate. And this is precisely what Mr. Narendra Modi did this time, when that thing was actually taken out from India Gate to this National War Memorial. So National War Memorial is actually a memorial. It is not a monument. Similarly, this idea of Samadhi was fascinating because there was a lot of discussion in the parliament. By the way, there is a law passed by the Indian parliament in order to define what Samadhi is. This is called Rajghat Samadhi Act that was passed in 1951. And most importantly, the question of monument also came up. And Nehru replied in the parliament, we do not want to have a memorial. We do not want to have a monument. We want a different thing. It should be completely post-colonial. And that's why Gandhi's Samadhi was protected as a site of memory. So therefore, the idea of conservation should not be reduced or should not be placed as if that it has got its own internal logic. It must be seen in its extension. So therefore, I think I would suggest you to look at that piece. It's available, and that's what I wanted to say. But thank you very much. It's a fascinating, presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal, for your very detailed comments, and I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought for Laurent also. On that note, I would like to close this very rich session and invite you all for our next workshop come seminar, which is next week, next Monday, Dr. Arnaud Kaba will be presenting his ethnographic work on glass, bangles, and crystal from Firozabad. And on that note, thank you once again to you, Professor Hilal Ahmed, and to you, Laurent Glattli, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you forget?
Sorry?